My long-distance boyfriend ghosted me, convinced me to come back, then trapped me in his house without food or water for 4 days. I was in a long-distance relationship with Tim and things seemed perfect, at least on the surface. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but we always managed to work things out. Then, out of nowhere, he ghosted me. One day, he just stopped responding to my messages and calls. I didn't hear a word from him for a month. No explanation, no closure, just silence. It was like he had vanished, leaving me with nothing but questions and a broken heart. I went through the motions of trying to move on, even though it felt like a part of me was missing. I replayed every conversation in my mind, wondering what I had done wrong or if there was something I could have said or done differently. My friends tried to console me, saying things like, maybe he needed space or he's not worth it if he can't even tell you why, but it was hard to shake off the feeling of being discarded, like I was nothing. Just when I was starting to think I needed to accept that it was over, Tim popped back up. Out of the blue, he reached out to me, begging for another chance. He said he made a mistake, that he was going through some personal issues and needed time to sort them out. He said he still loved me and couldn't imagine his life without me. He sent me a plane ticket to come see him, saying he wanted to make things right. Despite everything, despite the way he had shattered my heart, I agreed. Maybe it was the lack of closure, or maybe it was the hope that things could go back to the way they were. When I landed there, he was at the airport, waiting for me like nothing had happened. He greeted me with a smile and a hug, acting as if the past month of silence had never existed. I was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions: relief, anger, hope. Part of me wanted to scream at him for the pain he caused, while another part just wanted to believe his promises and forget everything. On the drive back to his place, he asked if I wanted to get back together, and in that moment, with all my feelings bubbling to the surface, I said yes. We arrived at his house, and that's when things took a turn. His entire family was gathered in the living room: his parents, his 2 brothers, and his sister, all sitting there in silence. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like the air had been sucked out of the room. There were no welcoming smiles, no friendly greetings, just cold, distant faces that made my stomach churn with unease. When Tim introduced me, it felt stiff, almost rehearsed, as if they had been expecting me but weren't particularly happy about it. The whole thing felt strange, like they were all part of some plan that I hadn't been let in on, and the uneasy feeling only grew stronger as I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. Then, my phone buzzed with a weather alert. I glanced at the screen and saw a warning for an incoming hurricane. I showed it to Tim, and he shrugged it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. That night, the storm hit. It was a full-blown hurricane, the kind that makes the walls shake and the windows rattle. I was scared, but I tried to tell myself that I was safe inside the house. Little did I know, the real storm was happening inside. The next morning, Tim woke me up by shaking me roughly, ordering me to come downstairs. His tone was cold, almost like a stranger's. I followed him, confused and nervous. When I got to the living room, his entire family was there, sitting in a circle, holding binders. I felt a knot form in my stomach. They each took turns reading from these binders, detailing reasons why Tim and I shouldn't be together. It was like some twisted intervention, and I was the main attraction. They read off lists of my supposed faults, dissecting every little thing I'd ever done wrong. I was stunned, humiliated, and completely blindsided. And then, as if on cue, Tim broke up with me in front of everyone. He said it was for the best, that we weren't meant to be together, and it was clear he had rehearsed this moment. But it wasn't just a breakup. It was a full-on execution. He then dropped the bombshell that I couldn't leave because of the hurricane. I would have to stay in the house for safety, but because I was no longer family, I wouldn't be given any essentials. That included food, water, and even a bed. I was to fend for myself while they rode out the storm. I stood there, dumbfounded. His family just stared at me with cold, emotionless eyes, as if I were some stray animal they were being forced to tolerate. My mind was spinning. How had I ended up in this situation? How had the man who claimed to love me turned into this cold-hearted monster? That first night was like something out of a nightmare. The hurricane outside was brutal. The wind howled, the rain pounded against the windows, and every gust made the house creak and groan. I wasn't offered a bed or even a blanket. I had to sleep on the living room floor, using my jacket as a makeshift pillow. The hardwood floor was cold and hard, and I couldn't stop my mind from racing. How had things come to this? How had the man who once professed his love to me turned into someone so cruel and heartless? By the second day, hunger had set in. I hadn't eaten since the day before, and my stomach was in knots. I could hear them in the kitchen, laughing and eating, while I was left to suffer in silence. It was like I didn't exist. Tim walked past me several times without even glancing in my direction. It was as if he had turned me into a ghost, just like he had a month before. Desperation set in by the afternoon. My head was pounding and I felt weak, lightheaded. I knew I had to do something, so I gathered my courage and approached Tim. I begged him for something to eat, just a piece of bread, anything. He barely looked at me, his eyes fixed on his phone. He told me that I wasn't welcome there anymore, and that I needed to figure it out on my own. I stood there, stunned, feeling like I'd been slapped. He turned away from me without another word, leaving me standing there in the hallway, feeling utterly abandoned. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until everyone had gone to bed and snuck into the kitchen. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. I grabbed a couple of cans and a bottle of water. It felt like I was stealing, like I was doing something wrong, but I was starving. I quickly ate in the dark, crouched behind the couch, hoping no one would catch me. I buried the empty cans in the backyard, feeling like some sort of criminal. The next morning, Tim's sister caught me sneaking back from the kitchen. She just stared at me, not saying a word. I felt humiliation burn my cheeks, but she didn't tell anyone. Later, she slipped me a small packet of crackers and whispered, "Don't let them see you take anything else. It was a small gesture." But in that moment, it felt like the world to me. She said I could come to her room for essentials as long as no one else knew. I muttered a quick thank you before she walked away. On the third day, the storm had calmed down a bit, enough for me to step outside. I needed fresh air, needed to break free from the suffocating atmosphere inside that house. But when I went back inside, I thought I was in the clear. I was wrong. Tim was in the kitchen when I walked in, and his eyes followed me with a suspicion that made my stomach drop. I quickly moved down the hallway, my heart racing, and slipped into his sister's room to grab what little food and a blanket I could find. I had just hidden my stash when Tim caught me. His face twisted in anger, and he demanded to know what I was doing. I tried to lie, saying I had dropped an earring, but he wasn't buying it. He called me a thief, said I was stealing from his family. He called me selfish and accused me of taking food from them when they needed it most. It didn't matter that the pantry was stocked or that they had more than enough to go around. To him, I was nothing but a burden. I was so shocked and angry I couldn't even find the words to argue back. I just stood there, feeling like I was about to break into a million pieces. I couldn't understand how he could treat me like this, how he could be so cold and heartless. I managed to mutter that I was leaving in the morning, but he just shrugged and said I should have left sooner. That night, I stayed up, too afraid to sleep. I watched the shadows dance on the walls, every sound making me jump. I felt like I was in a war zone. Not because of the hurricane outside, but because of the emotional storm raging inside me. I couldn't comprehend how the man I once loved could be so cruel. The next morning, the hurricane had finally died down enough for me to get out. I booked the first flight back home, packed my things, and left without saying a word to anyone. It felt like escaping from a prison. I was shaking as I got into the taxi to the airport, unable to process what had just happened. I thought that was the end of it, but a few weeks later, Tim had the audacity to show up at my office. I was at work, slowly trying to rebuild my life and put the whole nightmare behind me, when he walked in like he owned the place. That smug smile was plastered across his face, like none of it had ever happened, as if he hadn't kept me locked up, starving and humiliated for 4 days. He strolled up to my desk, casually acting like we were still on good terms, and said he wanted to talk. He actually had the nerve to suggest we clear the air and give us another shot, as if I was just going to overlook the torment he put me through. I was completely stunned, speechless even. He carried on as though I was supposed to forget everything and fall right back into his arms, like the pain he caused me was just some minor hiccup in our relationship. I told him to leave, but he kept pushing, saying he'd made a mistake and wanted to start over. I couldn't believe the audacity. My hands were shaking as I called for security. My coworkers noticed something was wrong and helped escort him out of the building. I was still shaking by the time he was gone. How could he be so delusional? That was the last time I saw Tim. I blocked his number, deleted him from all my social media, and made a promise to myself never to let someone treat me that way again. Looking back, I can't believe I ever gave him a second chance. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when someone shows you who they really are, you better believe them the first time. I didn't, and I paid the price. Now, I'm just trying to move on, to rebuild my life piece by piece and remind myself that I deserve better than the hell Tim put me through.